Okay, good evening, everybody. I'm Jeff Blossom with the Center for Geographic Analysis, and I would like to welcome everyone to the Harvard Geography Colloquium 2017. This is our first colloquium of the school year, and for those of you who don't come regularly, we hold these once a month from October through May. And I see a lot of familiar faces, and I'd also like to extend a welcome to the folks from Institute of Quantitative Social Sciences. Some of those folks are here. Also people from the Encyclopedia of Life. Any of those folks made it. The Center for Environment, another center at Harvard, and also the Department of Organismic and Evolutionary Biology. I'd like to welcome all those folks here as well. Tonight we have an extremely interesting talk with tons of incredible looking maps to look at. We have Dr. James Cheshire. He's a geographer with a passion for mapping data. He earned his PhD in GI science at the University College of London, and he's currently an associate professor at the same university. Recently, Dr. Cheshire received the Royal Geographical Society's Cuthbert Peak Award for advancing geographical knowledge through the use of mappable big data. Also with us tonight is Oliver Uberti. He's a visual journalist, designer, and the recipient of many awards for his information graphics and art direction. From 2003 to 2012, he worked in the design department of National Geographic, most recently as a senior design editor. So why don't you welcome me and join me in welcoming our speakers tonight.
Hello. Thank you for coming tonight. Thank you for having us. I want to start off by just talking a little bit about what we're going to share with you tonight. James and I collaborate across an ocean, an academic and a designer. And it's a bit of a unique pairing, but it allows us to do what we do. This is our second book that we've produced together through Dropbox and Google Hangouts and occasional visits across the ocean. But what we really want to share tonight is what we're able to do together because we collaborate and we have complementary skill sets. I come from a journalism background and from a fine arts background and designed the typography of the books, the cover, the illustrations, and I kind of direct a lot of the storytelling. And James crunches the numbers. He does the data processing, the GIS work, and we're always, on everything you're going to see tonight, we're working hand in hand at equal footing from concept drawn on the back of a napkin to the finished product that is up on the table there that you'll see. So we're going to show some examples of that, reveal a bit of our process, how we go from the numbers and spreadsheets that get extracted from the animal sensors to how it gets cleaned up and turned into a finished product. But first, I want to talk a little bit how I came to know James. And it started when I was at National Geographic. As a senior design editor at National Geographic, who comes from a fine arts background, I was always looking for ways to use my hands. This is a great example of a study that came from the EPA and Belfer University, where they were sampling fish tissue at sites all around the country and discovering evidence of pharmaceuticals in fish fillet and liver tissue. In this case, it's a largemouth bass that was sampled outside of Chicago. And to represent the data, I didn't just want to use, say, a computer rendering or sugar pills. I wanted to use the actual medications that were found in the fish in the actual ratios that they were found in the fish. So I set up a photo studio in a pharmacy after hours and assembled this largemouth bass out of Prozac and antihistamines. Another graphic that I worked on was this one, in where I heard about a researcher in London who was getting his PhD, and he was studying surnames. He was looking at the frequency and popularity of certain surnames in different parts of the UK. And I reached out to him to see if he could help me generate a map of the most popular surnames in the United States. This is what James and I created together. It's showing the top 25 surnames in each state, sized by frequency and colored by, approximate country of origin. So you see a lot of German and Scandinavian names up in the Midwest, some Spanish along the southern border, and then a pocket of French names down in Louisiana. And of course, up here in Massachusetts, you see some Irish names breaking into the top 25. And now I'm going to turn it over to James to talk about what we worked on next.
Thanks. So my day job really is looking at human geography. I'm a human geographer, I'm a GI scientist. And so it's a slightly odd transition perhaps into the world of animal data and animal mapping. And I'm going to talk briefly about how we made that transition, how we got to where we did. So about the time that I was working on this map with Oliver, I started a blog that was looking at ways we can map London. It was called Mapping London. And I was interested in this transition that seemed to be happening within the city and in other cities from a very data poor situation to a very data rich one, where there's been lots of advocacy and campaigning to open up data stores and things like that. And one of the key challenges with open data and open access is not so much making the data available, but actually making people aware that it exists. So half the battle is making the data available. The other half is increasing awareness so that people know that it exists and they can start to use it in more positive ways. So through that blog and through a series of kind of innovative maps of London that people hadn't really seen, I started getting approached by various publishers interested in producing a book, because everyone likes maps and everyone likes London, so a compilation of those two seemed to be a good idea for a number of, commissioning editors. And during that initial pitching stage, that process, it became really obvious that producing an initial map, a plot that we may use in an academic report or a book chapter or something like that, only gets you some of the way when it comes to actually producing a full-size kind of coffee table, full-color book. And so that's why I got in touch with Oliver, because I wanted recommendations for a designer who I could work with to produce the book such as this one. And Oliver at that point had actually just become freelance, and I think he thought I was a lot further along in the project than I really was. And so he said, "Oh, I've got a recommendation. I'll work on it with you." And that's kind of how the collaboration started. The slightly odd collaboration, perhaps, with a designer who'd only been to London once or twice, I think, before starting on the book project, and an academic who, I think we met him. We'd met once previously. So the book really was about revealing data and revealing patterns and revealing kind of interesting information to people that maybe haven't seen it before. So again, at the time, this was quite an innovative data set. It was 24 hours of flight paths in UK airspace, or specifically planes landing in London. Data collected in real time. We're used to it now. There's apps on our phone that we can use to view planes in real time. But back then it was quite new. And this graphic, which is a little bit trickier to see, was one of the first that was made from Strava data. So when we were doing this book, the Strava fitness app had only just started. It was kind of a new startup, quite popular with serious cyclists. We took that data, extracted the cyclists from it, and we showed an hour of journeys, rush hour journeys into and out of London. So in this case, blue is at 7 o'clock in the morning and orange is at 8 o'clock in the morning. You get a sense of this flow. Even 5 years later from showing this, I mean, some of this stuff looks a bit, we're used to seeing it now. Strava maps have come out quite a few times. But underneath it is a really interesting data set that can help with advocacy and can help with urban planning and changing in urban form, because in a sense, prior to these kinds of fitness apps and prior to this kind of technology, the only way you knew how many cyclists were traveling along a piece of road network was by standing outside and counting them. this isn't by any means perfect, but it gives you a broad brush coverage of a city that you can then use to better account for sort of cycling behaviours and things like that. And in fact, soon after the London book was launched, I did a keynote, a conference for office planning, office designers and things like that. And they were really interested in this data because it was a way for them establishing the demand for things like showers and bike storage and things like that for their potential occupants. So between us, we're kind of very much in the business of taking spatial data, geographic data, and visualizing it in interesting ways. And we're also very much in the business of doing it in a way that is perhaps quite traditional. It's something that takes a lot of traditional cartographic principles and putting them out on the page, not necessarily sort of going down the path of big data visualization, which we so commonly see now online. Graphics that perhaps look spectacular initially, but then you revisit them a second time and you actually wonder what it is they're telling you. Particularly like social networks are a really brilliant example. You get this big network diagram, it's a massive hairball of data, and that's the word you'll hear quite a few times today. You know, it looks spectacular, but does it actually give you anything useful? And so very much, you know, our process is picking through that manually and computationally to try and reveal a story. And the overlaps between the animal kingdom and the kind of city are quite striking because spatial data, as many of you will know, is formatted the same way. So this is a graphic rather than looking at the cyclist commute every morning. This is looking at a baboon commute in even much higher detail, in fact, than the Strava data. So this is a extract from a graphic that a series of researchers tagged a group of baboons with GPS loggers, and the resolution, the temporal resolution of the data was once every second. So over the course of a few weeks, they gathered a huge amount of information, specific locations for most of the troop. And the transition in data availability has made a big difference because it enables researchers to look at things at different spatial and temporal scales. Okay, so this is over the course of a day. So this is where the baboons sleep. They cross this open land here, and then they've gone out foraging around here, and then they've headed back home again. And it's kind of a zoomed out view of an area. But because we have the data at this very granular level for second by second, the researchers are able to sort of computationally establish the moment when a particular baboon makes a decision to go one way or another and whether the troop follows. So they were interested in establishing essentially how democratic this decision-making process is. It's not driven by alpha male and alpha females within the troop, it's more consensus-based. So we had 3 weeks of data at second by second intervals, and we wanted to try and articulate visually how that decision-making process worked, and then how do you then present that in the page for people to look at. So we zoomed in on this area at the top of the page here, this open land, this cropland where the baboons like to kind of run across it because they get harassed by local farmers and people who don't really like them being there. So we're capturing this moment here, and we're zooming in to see who kind of initiates the movement, what baboon is doing that. So each of these circles represents a baboon, and we've got males and females there, and smaller ones are juveniles as well. And you can kind of see them moving around. So this is them in the kind of trees, waking, starting to get moving in the morning. By 8:03, the baboons 11 and 12 are making a break from it. 8:06, you can see here that these two are the leaders, and this is a juvenile baboon and a mother. They're still going, and then suddenly there's this moment where they realize that no one's following them. You can see that they kind of double back a bit, perhaps a bit of hesitation, and then you see suddenly they stream right across within a few minutes in this area. And all the time this is happening, they get to the other side, there are these very minuscule kind of decision-making processes, and the researchers basically extracted two major approaches. There's the kind of compromise route where we have one and the other, one baboon going one way, one baboon going the other, and then there's sort of the average between the two. Or there's a clear choice where one follows, one goes and the rest follow. So this kind of observation is possible by spending hours and hours and hours in the field watching and carefully recording, but it's of course much more efficient and much better if you can record the data in this kind of level of richness. And so this is one of our favorite examples really of how technology and tracking have really transformed the way that we can understand animal behavior. And we've come a really long way. So this map, sorry, it's slightly faded, tricky to see, but this is quite a local map in many ways. It's created by a guy called Charles Townsend, who went through whaling logbooks in the 19th century and plotted the points on every map, points on a map where every whale had been killed. So it's a species of whale and its approximate location according to the logbook. And there's different color differentiation here, but it showed certain seasonality between where they were finding humpbacks and right whales and so on and so forth. And up until relatively recently, certainly in recent decades, this represented one of the most comprehensive data sets collected on whale movement. It was essentially a map of dead animals. It didn't give you much of a sense of movement, but it was a map that was produced to manage a resource, because that essentially is what animals were viewed at. It was a resource to be managed, and we meticulously collected data about that because it was an economic asset. So how do we get from this situation where no one's ever really seen a live whale to study it in the wild through to today when we have such amazing technology? And it's led to some quite interesting kind of developments and innovations by biologists in particular who were kind of seeking this information. So this was one of the earliest tags to be deployed on an animal, and it was developed by a guy called Rory Wilson in Swansea in Wales. And you can see here what he's done is he's kind of taken a syringe and retrofitted it with a spring running through the middle, and this is a piece of cork. And what he used to do was, I think it was a piece of magnesium that would be burning in the tube and would make a black mark as the spring got pushed, and that gave you an indication of how far the spring had been pushed in. And they would take the syringe and strap it to the front of a penguin, and if the penguin swam faster, he would push the cork in, and you get some sense of speed of how the animal was doing. And that led to some fairly remarkable insights. The penguins were swimming faster and further than he thought, and that was with this thing strapped to the front of them. You visit his lab now, and this is what you see. It's a screen that's probably about twice the size of this projector screen here, and it looks kind of like a mission control of animal movement. And that's something we've called it here. And this is just a few minutes of flight from a vulture that's circling over the Alps, and it's got magnetometers in it, data, accelerometers, it's got GPS, it's got elevation, it's got temperature. This thing is just collecting huge volumes of data. And it took me 15 minutes or so, sat in the lab, for them to talk me through exactly what each of these graphs meant. This was the one I understood most, because this was basically elevation. So you can see that the vulture's circling upwards here. This was the magnetometer and the head position and various other things, and that I really struggled with understanding understanding that, let alone trying to think about how we can visualize it. And so we were interested essentially in all our graphics really, is going from this kind of situation where there's a huge volume of data. It's increasingly well understood by the people that are collecting it through a series of quite specialist visualization practices. How do we take it to a general audience? So in the case of the vultures, what we did was we essentially extracted just a small chunk of this graphic here, and we charted it along with the air temperature, the thermal the vulture was in, plus elevation, plus you know, we didn't smooth the lines much because they were interested in looking at things like turbulence on the bird's wing. So you know, that's one graphic from probably 0.1% of one deployment of one animal. So it's pretty phenomenal, and the pattern kind of repeats itself across researchers. So these are some people that work at St Andrews, and they've developed these things called D tags, which are about the size of a computer mouse, and they put them on whales. So it's quite a big tag, but it's for a very big animal, and they detect sonar bounce backs from the whale's emission. So the whale would, a beach whale would send out some sonar, and then back it comes in if it's reflected off things, and then the sensor picks it up. So essentially this tag in a 12-hour deployment collects hundreds or more times as much data as was shown in that Townsend whaling map I showed you. That was, you know, comprehensive for a number of decades. And through it, you know, we were able to then take, again, quite a complex visualization called an echogram, and try and piece together a particular moment when a whale attempts to catch a fish. So in this case, we've got 5 seconds, so seconds are running from left to right. And then I don't know if you can just about make out, we've got columns here, so that's one column there, and there's another one, and then here you can barely distinguish the columns. And the width of each column is the time that's elapsed between each sonar emission from the whale. So when whales are swimming about just trying to find something to eat, they'll let out these clicks, and they'll be like click, 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 and it gives you kind of a kind of low resolution view of the world. Once they see something, they can then let out this buzz, which is very high resolution, and in this case, this is the signature that we're interested in, and this is it homing on a fish. Now, this was a really, again, a tricky one for us to understand, and it took me several trips up to St Andrews in Scotland to understand it. How do we extract, because they had so much other data and information about what the animal was doing. So the way you understand this is, if you imagine the whale's head is here, and it's swimming up towards the ceiling, you can see that over time the fish is getting closer and closer to the whale's nose. And then at this point, it becomes a bit fuzzier, and that's because the fish is doing a thing called a sea start. It's like curling up because it's realized that it's lunch. And then it does this kind of spring off here, and you can get that here, and you can get even, the fishes aren't very big that these whales are eating, but they can discern the individual fin beats from the fish swimming away. Now, the good news is at point D on this graphic, the fish disappears, and that's not because it's eaten, that's because it got out of the way and survived. So the tip that Mark, the researcher, told us was that basically if you're being chased by a whale, the best thing you can do is just step to one side, because they have a very narrow field of view. You can't outswim it in a straight line. So, you know, and there's some kind of evolutionary process perhaps behind that. Fish that survive versus fish that don't. And it's not just data about, you know, specific feeding events or specific animals that's being collected. Quite a famous example now are how researchers are using animals to be sensors for other data. So this, again, it's quite a large tag. It's quite heavy, and it gets stuck to the head of a seal. And within it, it collects information about ocean salinity and temperature, location and depth. And a lot of the funding for this kind of research is not about, you know, they're not interested in funding where seals go or seal behavior. They want to know the oceanographic data for looking at, you know, the impacts of climate change and so on. And so this project kind of has two elements to it. One is kind of animals as sentinels and data collectors, and one is the movement ecology themselves. And it was the first set of data that I got my hands on when I started thinking about mapping and working on this book. It's free to download online. And this was the first output I produced. And to me, it kind of contained and encapsulated all the excitement about why we were doing this book. You know, it's that big hairball I was talking about at the beginning. It kind of hits you square between the eyes that there's a lot of seals here and there's a lot of data. And isn't it complex, and isn't it rich, and isn't it exciting? And this really is what the book is about. This is the story we want to tell. I can't remember how many seals are in the data set, but there are different, I think these are colored roughly by individual. And incidentally, the best thing about seals and why they like to use them for this is because they get right into the edges of ice shelves and down into deep water trenches and things like that that conventional buoys can't get to when they're just drifting around the ocean. So seals are pretty valuable in this respect, and that was something else we wanted to show. So in terms of our process, and we're going to come on to that now, this is kind of what would happen. So I would generate something like this, send it over to Oliver, who then sends something back looking like this. So this is a very early version of the book's layout and design. And the key thing to notice here is all that color, all that differentiation between different tracks. Oliver's kind of washed out as it's all shades of gray, and we've got this. In this case, this is kind of a fictional line he's just drawn on for illustrative purposes, but we've got one orange line there. Instinctively, you know, and perhaps journalistically, he wants to tell the story of one individual animal rather than us trying to get our heads around that massive hairball. And this kind of approach is often used, you know, if you watch a nature documentary, you're not looking at the whole, colony of gannets or something like that on a rock in the middle of the Atlantic. You're focusing on one breeding pair or something like that that are indicative somehow of what's going on. So that's the kind of idea. We were thinking, oh, let's just do one journey, and then we selected one seal. This one was called Rudolph, after the reindeer. The scientists involved had various different naming conventions. One set was at the end of, it was at the start of the financial crisis, so they're all named after failed British banks as well, which from a data management perspective, you know, Bradford and Bingley isn't a very useful, unique identifier for something. So Rudolph was a nice, simple name, and it had he had a nice kind of story to tell about swimming south from the South Orkney Islands down the Antarctic Peninsula, spending a few months hauling out here, feeding, and then swimming back over the Drake Passage towards the Falkland Islands and along there. You know, it's a story you can perhaps more easily relate to. It's one that you can start to think about, and it just creates a kind of a cleaner impression of what's going on. And it starts, you know, generating questions for you, particularly about the kind of environment and experiences that the animal may be going through, the kind of terrain, if you like, it's covering. So we, in our final graphic, took a lot of time sourcing ocean bathymetry data and doing some terrain work, which Oliver's going to talk about a bit later, and really focusing in on this story. So the red line comes down here. There's lots of annotation. There's lots of various other things to help people understand the story. You'll see that this is the first hairball I created, and it's still there, but it's much smaller than you might have thought it could have possibly been. You know, you expect it's a big, complex thing. Why don't we shrink it? I'm surprised we were able to shrink it down this much. So we're still telling that aspect of the story, but it's not the main feature that we're interested in. And Rudolph is lucky because he has the privilege of getting 2 full-page spreads in the book. Not many animals get that treatment, because we're focusing in on the data he's collected as well. So this black line here is the diving profiles along part of that transect. Again, showing perhaps some of my naivety about the ecology of these particular animals. This line, the first line you see, is at depth of 1,000 meters. And I thought that there was a glitch in the sensor because the seal went down to 1,200 meters. But, you know, I was later told that that's actually quite common behavior for seals. They can dive up to 1,200 meters deep, which is pretty extraordinary, really. And they're, as an aside, they're looking at the seals can collapse their lungs and then reinflate them again. And it's useful to know how to reinflate your lungs and what the chemicals are involved, particularly in sort of emergency room situations and things like that. So there's kind of a third aspect of the data that they're interested in now, looking at these dive profiles. And then the color here represents a kind of interpolated temperature profile that we put on from the south to the north at the oceanographic data. So, you know, really we're telling lots of stories, but with, you know, taking up quite a lot of space to do that. And, you know, instinctively I would always try and cram as much on as I can, but I've learned to kind of be a bit more selective in the decisions I take. I mentioned before that we were interested in contextual information and understanding what the animal was passing through. This, I think, is something that's quite overlooked within the biologging community when they're making their maps and things like that. Kind of as an outsider looking in, the focus is on where the animal goes or the data they've collected, not necessarily on the external remotely sensed imagery. So we wanted to put as much of that in as possible. And I'm sure all of you have seen this. If you haven't, you should see it. It's a website called earth.nullschool.net. It's modeled wind data from global weather models, and it's kind of animated and projected, and it's just you know, a really brilliant way of representing wind. And you'll see lots of weather websites now use this kind of animation to predict wind, or to show wind. So we wanted to take that and use the similar style in our own graphics. So I wrote a script that took the same data and generated these kind of static images of wind. So can anyone guess where this is? No, it's not. I can see why you think that, because there's wind going round. Antarctica, yeah, that's right. So these are winds coming off the polar ice cap, and then these are the winds that are whipping around Antarctica. And the reason we wanted to tell, or we used this and we tell this story, was because we had data from migrating or wandering albatrosses that were circling the continent. And well, some circled the continent, others stayed near their colonies, others came a bit further away and went back again, depending on what stage of the breeding cycle they're at. But really, to tell this story, you needed to see what the wind was doing, because one of the kind of interesting facts that the researchers have established is that if you're an albatross, you can fly as far as these islands here and then fly back to your colony. If you get past these islands, it's easier if you go all the way around Antarctica to get back again. So, and you can really see that here, even though the data we have is quite crude, because this was actually quite an early biologging study. You get to see them. They kind of get, you see them get like whipped around Antarctica in those winds and then returning. So, you know, that was a really nice way of adding context and taking remotely sensed and modeled data and making sure that it was applicable, you know, in terms of time of year and all that kind of stuff to the animal data as it was. And I think my favorite example of this and kind of looking beyond standard base mapping and things like that is a graphic we produced that we're looking at snowy owls and their movements and hunting behaviors over the Great Lakes in the winter. And one of the things that the tags had revealed was that they were spending quite a lot of time drifting on ice, hunting birds and things like that, using ice as platforms. So this is a MODIS image taken from the same month of the data that we're showing. And then when we zoom in on the detail, we've actually got Landsat images from, again, the same time period where you can see things. Because crucially, we want, you know, we're showing where the birds are on ice and drifting on ice floes and things. You know, you want a base map that reveals that. You don't just want a generic satellite image that was taken from the summer. So it was really combining, you know, the, kind of my skills from the GIS background with some of the biologging data, I think, which enabled kind of the slightly richer representations that we were aiming for. I'm now going to kick over to Oliver, who's going to talk in a bit more detail about some of the design considerations.
So, and James gets it to a point where we've got this hairball, this export. He exports out all the GIS information for me, but then, you know, how do we get it to this final point? Well, one of the main things that I bring to the story is all the labeling, all the contextual labeling. And I spent a lot of time early on in the process, even before we started on our first maps, just establishing the typographic palette for the book. It's a custom book, they're custom maps. We have to figure out from the start, like in this book, what color is it? What font do we use for a road? How is a road different from a lake? How is it different from a tar lake in Venezuela? All these different geographic features, how do we encode them? And to illustrate that, I'm going to walk you through a story from where I live in Los Angeles. This is P22. He's a bit of an A-lister in Hollywood. You can follow him on Twitter. You can get t-shirts with his likeness on it. This incredible camera trap photo from Steve Winter for a story in National Geographic. P22 lives in Griffith Park. He is originally from the Santa Monica Mountains, but somehow he got across the 101 into Griffith Park, and now he lives there alone. The Santa Monica mountain lion population is effectively marooned on a genetic island by the freeways that surround it. And that story has gotten a lot of press, so much press that it's led to an initiative to build a vegetated overpass across the 101 to give the mountain lions an escape route to begin diversifying their gene pool. Further south in Southern California, there's another population of mountain lions in the Santa Ana Mountains, and they haven't been as lucky. People they connect with P22, they connect with the lions that are in Nicolas Cage's backyard in Malibu. It's closer to Los Angeles. There's more of an emotional connection. The same situation faces these other animals. So in our book, we chose to focus on the Santa Ana mountain population. And when we plotted all their data, you get this. Much like the seals, it's a great big tangle. Each cluster of dots is from one mountain lion. This is a list of all the different mountain lions down the left side, going back to around 2001 when the study began. And this doesn't tell you a whole lot. And it gives you a general sense of their range. The main thing you're seeing here is in the upper left, that's the Santa Ana Mountains and that island. And all of this here is the peninsular ranges running down eastern California and from the Mojave Desert down into Mexico. And that little gap in between is Interstate 15. The animals just can't get across that except for one. To give you more of this context, just like we did with the bathymetry on the seals and the winds for the albatrosses, we, on all of our land-based graphics, brought in digital elevation models. Now, coming from an arts background, I wasn't satisfied with just using imagery like this. I wanted to see if we could give it more of all the maps in the book, a bit more of a handmade quality. And there's a technique called stippling in art and rendering, where in the shadowed areas of an object, you put lots of dots. And in the lighter highlight areas, you put fewer dots. So James, being the amazing programmer that he is, it blows my mind. Every time I give him some like pie-eyed or pie-in-the-sky idea, he comes up with a way to do it. I said, could we take this digital elevation model and put lots of dots in the shadow areas and fewer dots in like the low-lying plain areas? And that's what he was able to come up with for all the regions of the world. So this gives you just the terrain that the mountain lion has to traverse. Then you see me figuring out how do we introduce the human environment that the animal has to engage with. Here's me working through the labeling in the fairly early stages of the book, coming up with the fonts that are going to identify the roads and the bathymetry and the political boundaries, and symbols to indicate not only different aspects of the landscape, but events like mortality or a predation event where a wolf in the book downs a fox. And then, this is just a glimpse of my screen in Illustrator with all the different layers, sorting everything by roads and drainage and park systems and lakes and shorelines. And then I start getting these emails from James with different data sets in them to add on to the terrain map. So here we've got all the drainage in Southern California, and it's the sort of thing that makes my eyes bleed as a designer. So I got to start developing a color palette of how am I going to take all this information and make it present, but also backgrounded, because the animals and their movements are what we care about the most. But we also care about the freeways that limit the animal movements. So I got to figure out a hierarchy system for interstates and regional roads and gravel roads. Start laying all this in together, and in the early stages, start to get something coming together like this. And it's all just like a balance. So you imagine a soundboard in a recording studio. You've got different levels for all the different tracks, and it's just managing that balance of, okay, how prominent do I want the roads to be? How prominent do I want the terrain to be? And keeping that all in balance. And here, it's not in balance. All this data, all the spots from all the other mountain lions, it's just still too present. The terrain color is kind of like a baby poop green thing. This is not working for me. But you have to, I'm an iterative worker, and I have to get everything on the page and then just start adjusting those levels. And working with the researcher and having these interviews and being in regular contact and constantly sending the researchers drafts for every animal we were looking at, we were able to identify 5 mountain lions that told 5 different stories. We had females that tend to stay near their birth range. This is one that just stays pretty close to home through their whole life and raises cubs. There's an outlier female here who went on this long weekend up to Palm Springs. And then we've got a male here born in the southern part of the Santa Anas, but if males stay around where they're born, they tend to get chased out or even killed by older males. So this male is dispersing and found territory in the northern end of the Santa Anas. You've got a male here who dispersed all the way down into Mexico and crossed back and forth over the border multiple times. But the story we really were focusing on is this of M56, who left the Santa Anas, went down to the beach, hung out for a bit, then went up along this road here and managed to be the only mountain lion in 17 years of study that crossed across the interstate. And really what they want is they want more animals going east to west, bringing new diversity into the Santa Anas. This one was able to get out. Unfortunately, got down here into the Harapul Valley and killed a sheep, and the rancher then hired someone with a depredation permit who killed M56 a few weeks after he was able to get across the interstate. It's a real challenge for these animals without a vegetated land bridge, because it's hard enough just to get across the road. Then you have to get across the road and survive long enough to pass on your genetics. So we go from this, where the colors aren't in balance, to what we ended up producing in the book. And you'll notice I took all that noise, all those other lions that weren't the main story, and I just cut them from the map altogether so we could use highlight colors to bring out the stories of the 5 individuals. Now, this is a story that shows where humans have gone too far. We realize that the roads are greater barriers, more significant barriers to wildlife than we originally imagined. But I'm going to end with a story that shows a counterpoint of humans taking wildlife into consideration, and one of the first places on Earth where infrastructure is being built with wildlife in mind. And that's in Kenya. I had great fortune to travel there and go on a elephant collaring expedition with Save the Elephants. And we went down to Tsavo National Park, where the country had just built a high-speed railway that connects the capital Nairobi inland to the port of Mombasa on the coast. And here you're seeing this elevated berm that runs the length of the railway on top under construction. And ultimately, they're going to replace this 2-lane road here with a multi-lane road. You could easily have the same situation that's occurring in Southern California with mountain lions. Luckily, Save the Elephants was able to, and a couple other organizations like Tsavo Trust were able to lobby the Kenyan government and the construction companies to get underpasses built at strategic points along the length of the railway, because this railway bisects Tsavo National Park. You've got Tsavo West here on the right and Tsavo East on the left. It's migration corridors of elephants going back and forth all the time, and they were really concerned with how this was going to disrupt their lives. So the idea was, what if we went down, these underpasses have been built into the railway, what if we went down and collared 10 elephants, 5 males and 5 females at different points in both Tsavo West and Tsavo East National Park, and track them to see which underpasses, well, 1, if they're even going to use the underpasses, 2, which ones are they using. And if we know which ones they're using, then we can target anti-poaching efforts around those areas. We can target all of our conservation around these, the choices, the animals, their preferences. So we went out, was able to go out there with them. The helicopter comes in, there's a trained veterinarian who hangs outside the plane, shoots a dart, trank into the elephant. Elephant goes down, helicopter lands, our jeeps pull up, everyone gets out. You've got vets and other wildlife techs administering care to the elephant to make sure its airway's open, pouring water on it to make sure the animal's cool. Meanwhile, Save the Elephants team and Kenyan Wildlife Service, they're attaching the collar. They're taking all sorts of measurements. If you're going to subdue an animal like this, they get as much information out of one tranquilization as possible, taking all their biological and medical stats. And this entire process of tranquilization, tagging, collaring, and then reviving was about 12 minutes per animal. It was unbelievable, like how clockwork they had it down to minimize the stress on the elephant. Here, the collar is being administered, and then after we all cleared out, they administered the revival anti-trank drug, and she wakes up. Weren't too thrilled about the number that got spray painted on her backside, but apparently the Kenya Wildlife Service wanted to do that, so when they're doing aerial surveys, they can easily keep track of the animals that are being studied. And here's what we see immediately. In the book, we show you 30 days, but within 24 hours of collaring, the elephants were already using the underpasses, which was just, Ian Douglas Hamilton, the founder of Save the Elephants, was just ecstatic. And as he told me, this is hot stuff right out of the horse's mouth. You know, that's the beauty of this animal tracking. It's just within 24 hours, we hadn't even gotten back to Nairobi. We're sitting at the lodge here in Tsavo National Park. We brought this up on their, they've integrated with Google Earth, and they could see immediately that day that the animals they had collared were already using the underpasses. And a key theme of this book is that it's tempting to think of animals as these furry robots that are sort of like operating out in the world on some Westworld type loop, right? Like pre-programmed to just entertain us. But in fact, they're not operating on a species level according to a script that even within a species, they're making all sorts of individual decisions all the time. And they react differently to different situations. So in this map in the book, you'll see 10 different reactions from 10 different elephants. And one of them up here in red is one named Manyani, who was collared off the top of this detail. And after being collared, she comes running down here in search of humans that she trusts, humans that make her feel safe. And she comes and spends the first month right around the Kenyan Wildlife Service field training school because she knows that these rangers are humans she can trust. And then you've got Rukinga here, who immediately crossed over using this underpass, and by the end of the month was crossing regularly back and forth right here. And so that's the story we're going to end with, because it shows you what's possible, not only with tracking, but with this new technology intersecting with ecology, where we can start to think that to protect animals, we need to protect where they go. And we can start building infrastructure and building human environments with wildlife in mind. So thank you very much for coming out to hear us tonight. We're happy to answer any questions about our process, and as much as we can about the animals and the ecology.
So yeah, let's open it up for questions.
So it's interesting you were talking about mountain lion on Twitter, because the similarity of this to other humans kind of eerie. It really seems like the thing that you're doing is the thing that do with a lot of human data, which is try to provide a background of the data with stories. Is that really what you had in mind at first? Or did the overwhelming amount of data sort of drive?
I think it. So certainly. So taking kind of human data, which is what we knew about. I knew about most before doing this project. I mean, it's particularly from kind of a social science background. You, I suppose, consider yourself an expert in a way in the kind of human condition, and so one of the things that I'm always keen to resist is sort of blindly applying kind of bottom-up machine learning type approaches to extract patterns from a data set. So you've got a massive hairball, you run an algorithm on it, and the algorithm says, oh, this is what the interesting stuff is. And I can kind of, well, we all can kind of assess it and say that doesn't seem quite right for what humans do and how they behave. Obviously for this data, I can't relate at all to what's important to Rudolph in the Southern Ocean. But the researcher who collected the data can, because they've spent a lifetime working on it. And so actually they were kind of that extra interpretive step. But it was very iterative in a way, because in many cases, the researchers themselves hadn't picked through the data in the way that we had. So we were picking out things like, oh, that's interesting. Why is it doing that? Or tell us about that behavior. And they hadn't necessarily seen it in that way themselves. So that then, you're back to the beginning slightly then, because you're then going back through the whole process to try and extract that particularly interesting story. So, yeah, I mean, you are right in the similarity, definitely crossovers between the two for sure.
I was curious if the GPS logging on one line, when the line did that crossing, was granular enough to tell when it made the jump, but it was logging like a day, and so you just know when it made a big leap, or could you actually tell what time it crossed? How did it get crossed?
Yeah, there's timestamps on every GPS location, and as much as possible, and where relevant and where it wasn't cluttering the maps, we include times in the book to help you get that granularity. But in this case, the mountain lion, if I remember correctly, it was at nighttime.
Back here.
With that as an aid, leaders want to get their own hands on and saying, all right, you pick this animal. What if I go in there and search baby elephants and see where they go, or whatever, right? Would that be available? And if yes, what kinds of system you would use?
Yeah, so it already is available. So there's this thing called MoveBank, which is a big data repository, and it's run by the Max Planck Institute of Ornithology, and it was a source for a lot of our data. So as is so often the case in academic researchers, you've got the guys that are protecting the data and won't let anyone have it, and then you've got the other group who are saying, please all come and have a look at it. So obviously MoveBank is very much for the second category. It has the infrastructure in it to receive real-time data feeds, and they've got some kind of test case. They've got examples of it in there. The challenge, well, there's a couple of things to think through. One is how you get the data off the tag and into the database, and that requires in real time. That's like cell phones or networks or satellite connections. And they're kind of working on that. There's this project that they're putting that will do that. And then the second challenge, and one that I kind of encountered trying to sift through the data, is one, it's raw. Well, is it raw data? Isn't it raw data? So has someone cleaned it or done something to it, taken out the stray GPS points, that sort of thing. And then how is it interpreted? So I think the data, so that the current situation is that the technology exists, the platform is available, but it's a specialist tool. Getting it the next step to kind of a wider audience, I think, is definitely an ambition they have. But it's probably a combination of resourcing plus time to get the kit out. I mean, I'd love to do something, where you can bring in, you can bring in some contextual layers and things like that, beyond just the standard Google map, which is what MoveBank currently.
There are some of the stories in the book. The researchers behind them do have their own real-time platforms. So there's a story on tiger sharks off the Hawaiian Islands, and if you go to the website of the researchers doing that work, you can track, I don't know, a couple dozen sharks in real time and see where they are around the Hawaiian Islands at that moment. Project Snowstorm is a great volunteer-run organization that tracks the snowy owls. On their website, you can follow and the updates. You can even get email updates of like all the animals and all the snowy owls are named, and they'll tell you like what Buckeye has been up to over the past few months. But at the moment, it's all these different research silos. And that was one of the goals of the book, right? Is to pull all these separate studies from separate scientific journals and separate researchers all together into one place. And I'm personally biased towards print because I want you to be able to enjoy these stories 30 years from now without having to update your browser.
You guys work with for kind of big data, perhaps like all of this information is going to be from your project. Have you worked with like crowdsourced citizen science, many participants?
So we have
eBird.
eBird in the book. We feature eBird out of Cornell, and we went there for a day. The citizen science stuff is really interesting anyway, because you know, you've got, I mean, eBird is exceptional in just the sheer number of responses it gets. It's huge, but it still experiences some of the challenges of basically, you know, you can only get a recording if there's a person that's seen a bird, and where are most people in cities, and all the action may be outside of a city and we can't see that. So, you know, one of the things that we're trying to bridge in the book is some of those. So they, you know, we essentially had a technical presentation from their tech team explaining how they, you know, interpolate that, or they do various things with it.
They also vet all the observations. Yeah. They've got a multi-check process where experts are vetting every observation. So, you know, we saw, was it Canada geese? Or no, it was the bar-headed geese in downtown London. Bar-headed geese we show in the book cross the Himalayas from India to Mongolia. So what are 3 bar-headed geese doing in St. James Park? We brought that up in front of them, you know, on eBird, and said, like, this is an error. Somebody saw a Canada goose, not a bar-headed goose. And they went in and checked the record, and in fact, it was an introduced species. I think someone had it as a pet or something, and they released it. But a local expert in London had gone in, an automatic you know, sensor had flagged it as like, this could be off, and then a local expert went in and verified that in fact there are bar-headed geese in St. James Park.
But yeah, so all that stuff, you know, we knew about, and it's a question of how you communicate that. That was a challenge, getting all that thinking across in some ways. And I mean, the eBird data is great. I mean, there's whole papers still to be written on their approach and approach to data cleaning and vetting and checking and things like that.
The wild thing about eBird, and we show a couple examples in the book of migrations of a robin and a magnolia warbler, is that through all these observations on a continental level, you can show the migrations of an entire species over the course of a year in a place, rather than just an individual. And you see this just like breathing of the continent as these neotropical migrants shoot out of Central America in the springtime. They fly up. We actually went, and the biggest week in American birding is on the southwest shore of Lake Erie. There's all these neotropical migrants in May come up and they pause in this swamp right along Lake Erie, and then, you know, they get some food, they take a rest, and then they cross Lake Erie and they go up into Canada to these boreal forests where they they nest, raise their young, and feed on all of these gnats and insects up in the boreal forest. And then they reverse that entire journey down in September, right around now. And when you see an entire species making that movement through these eBird maps, it really looks like the continent is breathing.
How did you choose which animals to map in your book and which researchers to work with?
It's a great question. We knew we wanted to have for your own enjoyment, when I was picturing the book that I'd want to read, I wanted to see a diverse array of locations, taxa, and technologies. So we created this wish list around the structure of land, sea, and sky. And like, what would be the awesomest land animals to map? And oh, we got to make sure we have something from Australia. And we tracked down this guy who tags crocodiles in the Cape York Peninsula. And it's an amazing story of crocodiles being a nuisance and getting into people's backyards. And in one case that we show, they airlifted this nuisance crocodile by helicopter to the other side of the peninsula and dropped him off in the ocean. Crocodile swims all the way around the peninsula and comes right back to where he was captured. So,
we took to asking, after we started off with a few, and then we just said to every researcher, who would you like to see featured in this book? And they would give us a name, and we kind of knew that when we were getting the same names again and again and again, we kind of knew that we'd got that. I mean, with the other thing, we were keen, there's a few big names who aren't in the book, partly because they didn't answer any of our emails, but partly because we were keen to the extent that we are raising awareness, to kind of spread it out across different researchers. I mean, one of the other interesting things, I'm relieved to see a good gender balance in this room compared to some of the rooms that we've been in, particularly in the ecology world, where you get this situation where there's a huge number of female students and postdocs, and then suddenly when it gets to the faculty level, they all just disappear for whatever reason. So we were keen to bring more female research voices and things like that into the book, and that was something actually we were, our entire editorial team at Penguin and that we developed this book with is female, and that's something they're really pushing as well. So you know, if there was a tie between two researchers, we'd go for the junior female one to try and get the numbers up. So we just didn't want it to be a book full of
old crusty white dudes.
Men with tech, which basically could have been. Any other questions?
Yeah, Penguin.
Yeah. Well, we enjoy, so Penguin. Yeah, for the London books, the same team. And actually, they were the only team. Well, we had several meetings with different publishers, and they were the only ones that would really challenge us on that stuff, and also give us challenges on other aspects of like broader things about what we were trying to do and the purpose. And I think that was something I was quite relieved by, because, you know, as a academic who talks to the general public, often colleagues may look down their nose at me and think I'm selling out or dumbing down, all those kinds of things. And to a certain extent, you know, there are media out there that would like us to do that kind of thing, but this talks really to why we like doing books as well. It's because the ethos is very much, if it's complex, if it's complicated, then it can remain complicated in the book, and you've got the space to explain it well. Whereas some of the others, you kind of got this sense that the attention span was maybe a little bit shorter than we would have liked for some of the stuff we would do. Yeah.
But man, we could talk to you for hours. There's so many cool examples. How do you track an entire ant colony? That's one of our favorites. We've got golden wing warblers that dodge tornadoes that were passing through the southeastern United States. It was really just a joy to see not only the behaviors of the animals, which I love learning about, but the innovation of scientists now. And it was all one size fits all, right? You can't use the same technology for a bumblebee that you'd use for a warbler that you'd use for a python. And in each case, the researchers worked with engineers who were developing these devices, sometimes from private corporations like Wildlife Computers out of Redmond near Seattle, to really figure out, okay, you know, what are you trying to study? For how long? What questions are you asking? What data do you want to gather? How much? How are you going to transmit it? And it's a real balance of because what is it, 3% of the animal's body weight or something like, you know, you can't have a little songbird with this giant elephant GPS collar on it. So there's lots of really innovative problem solving that goes on to it. And we're telling everybody we speak to, you don't have to have a biology degree to get involved in conservation. This animal tracking revolution invites more people from more disciplines into it. So if you're curious of how can I help, and you've got a knack for computer programming or cartography, scientists need more hands, they need more minds, they need people helping them problem solve. Okay.
One more question.
Can I ask a quick question about map making side and the GIS analysis side? Just a quick run of what software that you've used, how much of it's your own programming, how much is
So I consider myself a world expert in data formats now, because no two researchers use the same data format, and I was very keen not to burden them by saying I want this particular format. So they were sending me stuff in all kinds of different things I've never heard of. But the software I would use is QGIS, ArcGIS. QGIS was good for most things except map projections, and I get too technical, it uses GDAL, which is a bit flaky in cases, so I tended to use Esri products for that. But that was slow. Esri stuff is slow generally compared to some of the others, except for some of the hill shading and terrain work, where it's actually really fast. And then not making my life necessarily easy for myself, but it's what I know. I use R for a lot of stuff. So the terrain was generated in R, the wind maps were generated in R. A lot of the algorithm, the kind of automated programming stuff I did in R, which again, it was, you know, there's faster software. The thing that I really struggled with, we really struggled with, and we burnt so much time on, was 3D. Still got a long way to go. So we only have a couple of graphics that are kind of 3D or pseudo 3D. I ended up using a software called ParaView, which is a large-scale computing thing you can set up on big clusters of computers that fluid dynamics folk use. But it was the only thing that could really handle some of the larger terrain models and things I wanted to put in. But we had such a, I mean, I had such a rough time with 3D.
There's a map of.
I mean, I'm having flashbacks.
Yeah, there's a map of elk.
Yeah,
all these elk herds coming in and out of Yellowstone National Park, and it's like a collaboration with over 28 separate agencies. We're tracking all these different herds and brought them together, and we decided a bit masochistically that instead of just showing you like the ecosystem level portrait, that we would zoom in 3D to allow you to follow one elk as she makes a particularly arduous journey over these giant mountain passes to get from her wintering grounds and lower elevations to these summer feeding grounds in the lush grasses of Yellowstone National Park. And